Hello, welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Za. Today is April 1st, 2020, and we will continue our Taiwan history series. Last time, we had our returning guest, Taiwanese Communist Rapper Comrade Xiangyu on the show. Welcome, Xiangyu.
Hello. Good to be back.
Yes, immediately after our recording last time, I actually became sick. I don't know what I have. I don't even know if I actually caught the coronavirus because I have all the symptoms. I got a fever, scratchy throat, muscle fatigue, and I was basically bedridden for 3 days. Right after our recording finished, um, and thanks to my girlfriend Ani who took care of me, I am now mostly recovered. I think 80. I'm 85%. I'm well enough to record another show. I'm glad that you have the time uh, to make this happen. Let's just get this wrapped up because we cover a lot of ground last time. We covered from the prehistory of Taiwan all the way to the Japanese occupation and World War II, and we're gonna pick up today is we're gonna pick up from the post World War II situation, both on the Chinese mainland and Taiwan, and to just give a overview for our audience. World War II, it really changed the geopolitical balance of the world, and U.S. had a grand plan for the post World War II world. One of which is that the Roosevelt administration at the time intended for Chiang Kai-Shek led China to be basically the U.S. client state in East Asia, a proxy, if you will, or junior partner, as a euphemism.
Basically, what Japan became.
Yes, yes. But that plan unfortunately did not pan out, uh, primarily because the incompetence of the Chiang Kai-shek government and of him losing the Chinese Civil War immediately following World War II. Just give a little background. In 1944, during the very end of World War II, when Nazi Germany was basically collapsing, and the Japanese Empire was on its last leg. Uh, what the Japanese Imperial Army decided to do is to do a last ditch effort, because it was losing the war badly in the Pacific. A lot of the Japanese shipping back to the Japanese homeland was getting cut off, from the Japanese colonies in Southeast Asia. So what they intended to do is to link up, establish overland links. At the time, Japan controlled most of northern China and some coastal strips in southern China in places like Shanghai, Zhejiang, and Guangzhou, and Hong Kong. And Japan still control Vietnam, Myanmar, and much of Southeast Asia. So what Japan wanted to do was to establish overland rail links, by uh, pushing through the area still controlled by Chiang Kai-shek, because at the time, the U.S. Air Force actually fielded many bombers in China itself. We talk about this on our last show. We talk about bombing of Taiwan from the Chinese air bases, and this was carried out during the latter stage of the war, when U.S. planes bombers would take off from South airfields in southwestern China and start bombing Japanese occupied areas, including areas of China, and as well as Taiwan and Japanese homeland. And I think to everybody's surprise, Chiang Kai-shek's KMT force suffer a spectacular collapse. I mean, in Chinese, this is actually called 玉桂香大溃败. Uh, Yui is a Chinese name, an ancient Chinese name for Helan. Gui is another name for Guangxi, and Xiang is another Chinese name for Hunan. So basically, the three provinces that was the main theater of the Japanese Operation Ichigo campaign, and the Chinese defender actually put up a very dogged fight at a city, a Hunanese city called Henyang. The defender held out for over a month, uh, despite overwhelming Japanese numbers. But uh, due to the nature of Chiang Kai-shek's army, even though he had many men nominally under his command, none of these KMT general wanted to rush in to rescue the defenders in Henyang because they don't want it to weaken their own forces, which is how they derive their power. In the end, the Japanese army achieved their strategic goal of linking up, basically from northern China all the way to Vietnam, the real link. And the Roosevelt administration was sorely disappointed in Chiang Kai-shek, and they then entered secret negotiation with Soviet Union with Stalin to invite Soviet to declare war on Japan because they realized, okay, the war might last longer than expected. And as a result of that, the Soviet Stalin demanded a couple conditions. One is that the Outer Mongolia, which is nominally still part of China, will be allowed full independence, and also the Soviet Union will gain the former Russian trade privileges in Manchuria. I mean, basically, northeast China, aka Manchuria, will become return to being a Russian sphere of influence after the war.
This was undone after Zhou Enlai and Mao negotiated in Moscow and signed the Sino-Soviet
Right, but
friendship
that
treaty.
came later, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
during the World War II, that was the deal that was wrapped up. So as a result,
And I want to add to sorry, I want to add to the audience that it was really Stalin's involvement in the Pacific theater that really forced Japan to surrender
yes,
because
yes,
it wasn't the atomic bombs. The atomic bombs were primarily dropped to show Stalin the US might. They picked Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they were the only two cities that hadn't been conventionally bombed yet,
yes,
basically.
because U.S. was conducting the Pacific campaign, island hopping, getting closer to the Japanese mainland, and then there was extensive air campaign against Japan. So, like you say, the only few Japanese city was spared. One of the few city was the ancient Japanese capital Kyoto, because at the time, the State Department had a Japan expert who advised against bombing Kyoto because of the symbolic value and the ancient artifacts, and Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August, in the so-called August storm, when a million Red Army uh, went across Siberia, invaded Manchuria from all fronts, including the side of Mongolia, from outer Mongolia, and very quickly, in matter of a month, Soviet Red Army took over the entirety of Manchuria north of the Great Wall, and of course that also prompted U.S. to drop the atomic bomb, forcing Japan to surrender. and the Soviet agreed to stop their advance at the 38th parallel in Korea.
Korea,
So
yes.
they
That's part of why Korea, even though it was a victor nation, was divided as opposed to Japan, because it made the division in Germany, as it turned out eventually, made sense because Germany was defeated during World War II. The fact that it happened in Korea just kind of shows that Korea it demonstrates the geopolitical importance of the Korean Peninsula, which we'll actually get into despite this episode being about Taiwan, because somehow it ends up playing a huge role in Taiwan's fate after
it's all
Chiang
part
Kai-Shek
of
got
the Grand Cold War, right? In East Asia, it's
yeah,
all connected. And
because we're talking about the front line of the Cold War in East
I
Asia.
mean, originally, I don't think the neither Soviet Union nor U.S. care about Korea too much. There was a decision to kind of divide up the sphere of influence, and I mean, Stalin did not want to jeopardize the ties with United States. So even though the Soviet Union actually has the boots on the ground, so to speak. The Red Army pushed from Russian Far East into Manchuria down to Korean Peninsula, but they agreed to stop at the 38th parallel, to allow the Americans, to come in to ship in their their South Korean proxies and take over the South. And in doing so, one result of that is, in South Korea, a lot of the old Japanese colonial structure got left in place. So basically, the Japanese have departed from Korea, but all the former Korean collaborators were
They were the new people in charge.
exactly, they were left in charge in the U.S. controlled part of the southern part of the Korean Peninsula, and we'll talk about
And
that
this is
later.
very important to tell about to tell to certain people in Taiwan who they think that the Cairo and Potsdam communiques and declarations are invalid with their they have their historical revisionism and their reasons, but and they said that Taiwan should have been a trustee what is it, a trusteeship
Yeah,
of the UN, like South Korea, and they said that that would be so much better than Chiang Kai-Shek. But I beg to differ.
I mean,
I feel like it would probably be.
that's a lot of
I mean, okay,
legalese talking. I mean, but
who did the U.S. put in power in South Korea? Syngman Rhee, and then what happened after him? Park Chung Hee.
I mean, the thing is, as we mentioned before, at this point, Chiang Kai-shek was still U.S. chosen boy. You know,
That quickly changed, and we should get into that
yes,
soon.
because in the post World War II order, U.S. still envisioned Chiang Kai-shek led KMT control China as a U.S. proxy. So to do that, Japan had to give up all its possession, all the colonies it gained through war. Way back, all the way back to first Sino-Japanese War. So Taiwan was included as a territory that Japan must give up. Taiwan and Korea, and
Yeah, we mentioned this in the last episode.
yes,
If for listeners who don't know, we get, go into a lot more detail than we're going to go into today.
yes, and because of that, even South China Sea, the claim, now the U.S. is making much ado about the so-called Chinese claim on South China Sea, the nine dash line that claims 2/3 of South China Sea. The claim actually originated with Chiang Kai-shek because right after World War II, Chiang Kai-shek drew a map, drew a 11 dash line across South China Sea. Basically, at the time, Japan had to give up all its claims on in the islands of the South China Sea, and Chiang Kai-shek decided to move in. And this time, Chiang Kai-shek was backed by U.S. government because like U.S. through land lease agreement give Chiang Kai-shek a bunch of ships and allows Chiang Kai-shek to sail his navy putting territorial boundary markers all over South China Sea. It was okay by U.S. back then because Chiang Kai-shek was U.S.'s boy, and at the time, all the surrounding nations like Philippines was a U.S. colony back then. Vietnam was supposed to return to being a French colony, and so there was basically no competing claims against Chiang Kai-shek at the moment, right? So at that time,
Yeah.
uh, Chiang Kai-shek claimed South China Sea. He was also at his probably own peak of his personal prestige as a Chinese leader that triumphed in the war against Japan in World War II. And but unfortunately, Chiang Kai-shek, what his plan is has always been to watch out for himself and to monopolize power in China, and he absolutely did not want to share power at all with the communists who did control a large swath of northern China as a result of the Japanese occupation, because the communists established a series of bases in northern China after the Japanese army rode in and basically destroyed the previous the governmental structure. So the communist guerrilla established a parallel government in the countryside, where they collect taxes from the peasantry and organize guerrilla militias. And at the end of World War II, most Chiang Kai-shek's KMT forces are in southwestern China, in Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou, and
Yeah.
to help him,
That's why there's so many of you guys in Taiwan.
yes, and to help him, um, the U.S. airlifted Chiang Kai-shek's troops from southwest China to the various part of China to take over, to accept the Japanese surrender and to take over. Now,
Yeah. One thing I want to mention is as you're saying this is the Republic of China throughout all of its history from 1912 or 1911 or 1010 1911 or like is it was officially declared on January 1st, 1912. But anyways, from then to 1949 it was hardly ever a truly unified country.
no, it's not, because
Yeah.
it's
You had warlords in the north for a while, and then you also had like Yuan Shikai trying to do his thing, and then you had, communists setting up bases all over the place. So I mean, yeah, the PRC was declared in 1949, but they had administrative they had a history of governing China for much longer than that.
yes, because the Chiang Kai-shek's government was only nominally the government
Yeah.
of China. It's acknowledged by world powers. It's acknowledged by various warlords in China, but on the ground, the reality is a lot different because
Which gets very interesting because you know how the National Assembly that governed Taiwan for decades was actually elected in 1947 when the new constitution was ratified, right? And
let's
yeah,
let me backtrack a little bit, right? Because the Chiang Kai-shek actually was able to consolidate his power during World War II under Japanese invasion, because he was able to leverage that to his own advantage by getting rid of some of the warlords, especially even towards the end of World War II. For example, in Yunnan, he ordered the Yunnanese warlord Long Yun to lead his army into Vietnam to accept the Japanese surrender over there. While Long Yun was gone, he sent his own his own protege down to Yunnan to stage a coup to take over the province. And there was a lot of similar happening around the time. But as you say, the China was not really a truly unified country. And but Chiang Kai-shek, at the time, U.S. did wanted Chiang Kai-shek to form some kind of coalition government with the communists, because with Chiang Kai-shek as the head of government, of course, because U.S. did want China to be its proxy client state junior partner, if you will, in East Asia. However, that's not something that Chiang Kai-shek wanted, because at the time Chiang Kai-shek had overwhelming power. He held the most military, and he was fully supported by U.S. through the early part of the Chinese Civil War. So the negotiate. So the communists, the Mao Zedong actually flew to Chongqing, uh, with personal guarantee of his safety by the Americans. And but the negotiation eventually broke down because the Chiang Kai-shek couldn't agree to have the communists to keep their own army and their own bases and do have like a representational power sharing arrangement. Instead, Chiang Kai-shek thought he can resolve this through force of arm because he actually his forces compared to the communists, vastly outnumber the communist forces, and he seemed, at least on paper, he looks to have the upper hand. But as a consequence of the Soviet invasion, occupation of Manchuria, there was a. This is when the cold, right after the World War II ended, the Cold War really started in East Asia because as soon as the Japanese surrendered and the Soviet Red Army camping out in Manchuria, Chiang Kai-shek started to work with Americans, trying to, push the Soviet out and to ship his own men all the way from Southwest China to Northeast China and Manchuria to take over. Now, this alarmed Stalin because originally Stalin thought he had agreement with the KMT that meant Soviet Union was supposed to keep all the privileges of former Tsarist Russia in Manchuria. But when American Marines and the Navy start shipping KMT troops to Manchuria, that alarmed Stalin, and so originally Stalin agreed to a peaceful transition of Manchuria to the KMT rule, to Chiang Kai-shek, right? That was a deal. In return for a recognition of independence of Mongolia and special Soviet privileges in Manchuria. But when the American Marines start landing close to Manchuria in places like Qinhuangdao, um, basically,
That's when Chiang Kai-shek declared that agreement about Mongolia to be to be invalid, which is why Mongolia to this day is still included on the so-called ROC map.
right, right. But he reneged much later because what
Yeah,
happened was that the Stalin saw that the Americans are closing in and they're really embedded, literally embedded with the KMT troops. So then the Red Army secretly starting to hand over the capture the Japanese arsenals to the Chinese communist guerrillas who were infiltrating Manchuria at the time. Because right after Japanese surrender, the Chinese communist headquarters in Yan'an, they made a decision to send 100,000 communist Red Army veterans into Manchuria to basically to work with the Soviet Red Army and but to also to take over some of this the administration of the region. And so this was happening the behind the scenes, so that when the KMT arrived, on American ships to take over from Soviet Red Army, they found that the Chinese Communist Army was already on the ground, and they were shocked. And this was the beginning of the Chinese Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek had Americans help him shipping 500,000 men to Manchuria, some of his best troops, crack troops. But the communists were able to stage a stunning victory in Manchuria and eventually wipe out Chiang Kai-shek's best troops there, and and also elsewhere. There was a series of campaigns between 1945 and 1949 that resulted in a surprising and decisive communist victory on the Chinese mainland. Now, this was unexpected. Like what the U.S. had basically had to readjust its East Asian policy because here Chiang Kai-Shek no longer is no longer seem to be able to control China, and so eventually, Japan, the defeated power of World War II, was rehabilitated by United States as its replacement junior partner slash proxy client state in East Asia. Now, this series of events, of course, had serious consequences for Taiwan because like 1945 or Taiwan has already been under Japanese occupation for
50
50
years.
years. Like there's already that not only physical separation but also a different people in Taiwan and people on mainland went through kind of parallel but separate development because people in Taiwan lived as subject of Japanese empire, as a subject in a Japanese colony, whereas the people on mainland China, they went through the very very brutal Japanese invasion, and as you mentioned, what we mentioned in the last episode, there was an experience of the Taiwan was actually being bombed by the American bombers flew in from Chinese mainland. So the difference was, so there was a quite a bit of a difference in the 50 years leading to the handover. And on top of that, when the KMT is starting to send their troops to Taiwan, in country like you mentioned this last time as well. Whereas before, most of the Chinese who came to Taiwan, came mostly from Fujian, right, the province straight across the Taiwan Strait, or some of them came from the Hakkas came from eastern Guangdong, but from the southeastern Chinese coast, and they either speak Hokkien or Hakka. Um, but the new crop of troops under KMT that came to Taiwan, they came from all over China. They speak different languages, speaking different dialect, have different customs, and also they.
It was that single event that really contributed to Taiwan's culinary diversity.
Yes, yes, that would come later. Um, but at the in immediately after 1945, though, it wasn't clear that Taiwan would be separated from the Chinese mainland because at the time in the early part of post World War II, Chiang Kai-shek looks like he was about to win the Chinese Civil War. He staged a major offensive into all the communist areas. He scored a major victory in Manchuria. He was on a road from 1945 to 1946, right? And but by 1947, things start to change. The momentum start to shift to the
Both on Taiwan and you'll find in the mainland. And in Taiwan, that the KMT suffered a major blow to its support because at the beginning of Taiwan's retrocession, most of the Taiwanese people welcomed the KMT despite some of the things we mentioned. But after 2 years of rule, tension really started building up because of things like unemployment, hyperinflation, and because the KMT was carrying out the civil war on the mainland. A lot of grain from Taiwan was exported to the mainland. So even though Taiwan was no longer colonized by foreigners, Taiwan lost. It was to many people there was less stability than there was when Taiwan was a Japanese colony before, especially before World War II really impacted them.
Yeah, and this is important because in some way, what people experience in Taiwan is similar to what people experience under the Japanese occupied China because what when the KM first of all the all the people, whether on Taiwan or on China, on mainland China, they all suffer the deprivation of war. And one of the consequences of the war was a shortage, and that devastation of economy didn't end with the end of World War II. And one of the problem is because Chiang Kai-Shek decided to immediately pursue a civil war, right?
Yeah.
Most of the resources got plowed in to pursue the military victory against the communists. So even though people should,
And that was before U.S. aid started really kicking into Taiwan.
yes,
So standard of living was very it was a very tumultuous time.
yes,
So you'll see how this erupts in the February 28th incident in 1947.
yes, and the KM, I can speak about the KMT practice on mainland, and maybe you can talk about on Taiwan specifically. So what happened? The when the KMT, I think maybe it's analogous to like the carpetbaggers because of the KMT officials who mostly have been hiding out in southwestern China throughout the war. Now, the time of Japanese surrender, they suddenly swooped in into the former occupied territory, and the all they start to take over a lot of the Japanese held property, which were basically,
Happened in Taiwan too.
yeah, which those property were previously expropriated by Japanese Imperial Army to support their war effort, and now what the KMT is doing is they just swoop in and trying to take over the best property for themselves. Like a lot of the KMT officials got fabulously wealthy in the process. Like my one of my paternal grandfather, uh, he lived in Haining, Zhejiang, and during Japanese occupation, he was he had his medical practice inside the town of Yuanhua, and when he went to his clinic, he has to go pass through a Japanese checkpoint, and the Japanese soldier demanded all Chinese to bow down to the Japanese soldiers at the checkpoint. And my grandfather refused to bow down, and for that he the Japanese soldier slapped him across the face, and my grandfather felt very humiliated. So he went out and seek out to join the underground resistance, right? And there was no communist resistance in around Zhejiang, so he joined the KMT underground resistance, and he was mostly involved in like printing propaganda, anti-Japanese propaganda posters, and plaster them all over town, stuff like that. But after the war, when KMT official from Chongqing came to the town, they basically told him, "Okay, you guys can all go home now. We'll take over." And these KMT officials, they divided up all the spoils of war for themselves. All the properties they confiscated from the Japanese, who previously the Japanese confiscated from their previous Chinese owners, now just became personal property of these corrupt KMT officials. So there's as a result of Chiang Kai-shek pursuing the civil war, the hyperinflation went crazy. The paper currency was becoming worthless because the KMT was starting to print a lot of paper money, and like its economy was already in shambles, and when the KMT decided to pursue the war, one of the thing about the communist base is that most of the communist base in North China, they control the countryside. So they control a lot of the uh, um, agricultural producing regions, right? And so that did not help with the hyperinflation at all. And so there was a lot of resentment all across China against the KMT rule at the time. Maybe you can talk about specifically, some of the discontentment in on Taiwan itself.
It's even worse in Taiwan because remember, Taiwan had been separated from the mainland for 50 years, and you have a new set of Chinese people coming in who were from different parts of China than before, and they spoke different languages, as you said, and there was this sense of division. We have like the Benshengren, which technically it includes everybody in Taiwan whose family was in Taiwan before the retrocession in 1945, but it's predominantly centered around the Hoklo people, or the people from southern Fujian whose families began immigrating to Taiwan from around 400 years ago until the Japanese era. And so on top of these this sort of resentment against the government, you also have kind of a resentment towards mainland Chinese people. Remember, and then a lot of these mainland Chinese people who came to Taiwan, because mainland China was very poor back then. They were like dressed in very poor clothes. Some of them had never seen elevators before, for example, and there was this sort of era of superiority by some Taiwanese people, and it's kind of valid because at the same time, the KMT was very distrustful. The KMT was very distrustful of the Taiwanese people, considering them to have been, Japified, Japanized, whatever that word is, like 日本化. And so then many of the civil servants in Taiwan, who like Taiwanese civil servants who worked in government, were just who did administrative stuff, were fired and replaced with mainlanders, who many of whom were underqualified, to be perfectly frank. So then there was a sort of, well, mainlanders don't like us and we don't like mainlanders. And then you have all of those issues that, all of the qualms that the people in the mainland had against the KMT. You add all of that up. So it's just contradictions upon contradictions.
Yeah, I mean there was his
And
reason why Chiang Kai-Shek lost in the Civil War. I mean he totally
yeah,
mismanaged the country after World War II. He went from being the kind of hailed as the leader of China,
even before World War II.
in August 1945, when Japanese surrendered, into this really reviled figure and hated across much of China because all the problems that was brought on both by the handover and also the following civil war that he pursued, and
I feel like most of the supporters of Chiang Kai-shek at that time were like Chinese people abroad who were very patriotic towards China and didn't have to live
exactly,
under him.
exactly. All this led to eventually led to a blow up on Taiwan in 1947 in what now known as 228 incident, the February 28th, or sometimes known as the February 28th massacre in Taiwan. It was just basically a big Taiwanese insurrection against the KMT rule. Would you like to talk about that?
So I'm just gonna go over it briefly because I think the implications of it are much more important than the actual happenings of the event. And also, it's interesting because it's been such a it was a banned topic for many decades until either the late 80s or early 90s. So then, as soon as people were allowed to talk about it, it also gave the ruling class a lot of room to maneuver because you have a new generation that didn't grow up experiencing it. So it was kind of a complicated event that got simplified to just mainlanders killing Taiwanese people, which that did happen, but that isn't the whole story. So basically, on February 27th, the Tobacco Monopoly Bureau sent out an enforcement team to in Taipei, and then they confiscated illegal cigarettes from a woman named Ling Jiangmai. So then things escalated. She was pretty much like, yo, what the fuck, give me back my cigarettes. So then one of the people on the enforcement team hit her with his rifle. And as we mentioned, people in Taiwan were already very dissatisfied with the KMT and mainland Chinese people in general.
So that was just a triggering point, right? I mean, it triggered all the discontent that was being built up since 1940.
Yes, but it was nothing until afterwards. And another thing I want to mention is though it's unfortunate because the new rulers, the new government was comprised mainly of mainlanders. But then as you can imagine, it's not just Taiwanese people who were oppressed by the KMT. Other mainlanders were definitely oppressed by it. Otherwise, why did they kick them out of the mainland? But I'm also talking about mainlanders in Taiwan. And then when the 228 incident happened, and there was blowback, mainland civilians, many of whom weren't even government related, were also targeted by mob beatings and killings and rapings and stuff like that. But then that's underplayed today because it doesn't fit the narrative of the people who are in control, unfortunately. But anyways, things escalated, and then Taiwanese passersby intervened, and then they surrounded officials who ran away. So then that crowd ended up going to the police station and the government to complain and protest about the incident. And they were also voicing their frustrations about their grievances over unemployment, inflation, corruption, and that sort of stuff. So then soldiers shot into the crowd to disperse them, and a few of them died. So then, as you can imagine, people were already upset with the KMT, and that was like the last straw. So then, by March 4th, protesters took over government buildings and military bases, and then they announced the incident that occurred over the past few days over the radio, and it caused uprisings throughout all of Taiwan. Like, people were it wasn't just uprisings, it was also targeted beatings of mainland families and stuff like that. It's so bad that some mainlanders who moved to Taiwan after World War II ended up moving back to the mainland. And then martial law was enacted by the KMT with curfews enforced. So then if people violated curfew and walked out at night, they were either arrested or shot. So as you can imagine, riots broke out. And
I just want to point out that the anti-mainland violence that did occur. I mean, it's almost unavoidable in this kind of mass movement with no like a clear political organization or ideological leadership, right? I mean, because this was
it was a big tent thing. There were many people of different camps frustrated at the KMT for various different reasons, and there were communists involved, but it wasn't like a communist movement.
Yeah, this was basically people dissatisfied by the KMT misrule in Taiwan, and it unfortunately for a lot of the mainland families who came over to Taiwan after 1945, they became associated with the hated KMT rule, and they basically become a kind of a
even to this day,
became basically scapegoats and became the target of those resentment. And because they're the ones that's most visible, right? Because you're not gonna reach the freaking KMT official.
Linguistic barriers are much more tangible to people than like class divisions and power divisions and stuff like that.
I mean, a lot of the times that the conflict like this became some kind of either like a ethnic conflict or rather than class conflict, because it just that different difference in identity and culture sometimes it masked the real class struggle that was happening.
And the KMT actually took advantage of that, like telling the mainlanders, hey, the Taiwanese people don't like you, we're here to protect you. And then basically So around that time, 32 demands were also raised by, it was a lot of students and a lot of people from all walks of life. Their demands were basically democracy, the right to strike, the requirement of 2/3 of the government commissioners to be people who have resided in Taiwan for more than 10 years, because they felt that the people in government were out of touch with happenings in Taiwan, which was
Yes.
very true, I must add. And then all this time, the governor of Taiwan then, Chen Yi, different character, not like the Chen Yi in mainland China, the different Yi, but he just kind of stalled as he asked for reinforcement from mainland China. So then that arrived on March 8th, I believe, and they docked at Keelung, which is the northernmost city in Taiwan. It was a port city, and that's when crackdowns really began, and that's considered to be like the beginning of the KMT's White Terror in Taiwan. You had people just on military vehicles just shooting indiscriminately at people for a few days, and around that time, even like my grandmother is from Tainan, southern Taiwan, and even she has memories. She said like around that time, like she remembered just seeing dead bodies like while she was walking, like just walking around during the day, like to and from school or whatever, or no work. I think it was no, it was school. Yeah, and that's when martial law was enacted. Martial law remained until 1985 when it was lifted under the leadership of John Jingo, when there was like a another wave of like a lot of pro democracy, like bourgeois democracy, I must add, movements. And during this time, it was interesting. You had militias forming, and perhaps one of the most notable one is called the 二七 部队, or the 27 Brigade, organized by Xie Xuehong, who was a Taiwanese Communist Party leader who ended up escaping to Hong Kong 3 weeks after the whole event before moving to Xiamen in the mainland. She ended up dying in Beijing.
Chiang Kai-Shek was also, his regime was also very paranoid about possible communist infiltration and led insurgencies, because 1940.
To be sure, there was communist
Yes,
infiltration
but
going on.
at the time, 1947, this was a time when things are not. Chiang Kai-shek was starting to realize the Civil War wasn't going the way he was expected to. The tide was gradually starting to turn in the communist favor, and to have this happen in Taiwan, it was a bit of a shock, right? And then he was already paranoid about seeing communists everywhere, red menace, and this just gave him a excuse to further crack down.
And if you want to know more about the 228 incident, I highly recommend the film City of Sadness, 悲情城市.
Is this a Taiwanese film?
It's a yeah, it was one of the first major films about 228, and I think it's rather objective,
Okay, so
considering the political, considering how this is such a
yes,
contentious topic.
divisive, even till this day.
It's very
I mean,
divisive.
you really divided the among the different communities in Taiwan. Especially into the mainlander versus the Benson, or the local Taiwanese camp.
So around this time, the U.S. was also losing faith in Chiang Kai-Shek. They were just like, okay, he's not reliable, and since he lost the mainland, we're just not going to intervene. We're just not going to, whatever. Taiwan is done for. It's going to be taken over by the Chi-Coms, as they call them, the Chinese
Yeah,
communists. So that was also the attitude in Taiwan. In Taiwan, many people like to say that the 228 incident marked the beginning of Taiwan independence movement, but I think outside of like intellectuals, like I think most of the people more realistically thought that Taiwan was going to be liberated by the
yes.
communists. And during this time, there was a U.S. diplomat named Livingston T. Merchant, and he was sent to Taiwan on a field mission by Atchison to see if there could be an autonomous government set up. I think I mentioned this in the last government, but I'm just going to recap it. he basically told the governor of Taiwan, the Chen Yi, if he separated the provincial government from the national government and cut off communications with the communists, the U.S. will send a bunch of like 25 million annually. Taiwan will be like will be occupied by the allied forces, kind of like Korea, and then there will be a transfer of power to a new government, and then Chiang Kai-Shek can go to Taiwan as a political refugee, but then that didn't happen. So you can see that after around that time, what to do with Chiang Kai-Shek and what to do with Taiwan was a very heavily debated topic in the U.S. And we can't, and it's hard to just say that, the U.S. wholeheartedly supported Chiang Kai-Shek or Taiwan independence or this or that, because it was very divided. And there was a section of imperialists in the U.S. who did not want to split China along the Taiwan Strait. They didn't want to recognize the new socialist government, but they also wanted to cut ties with.
That all became
They,
relevant after the communist victory on the mainland, right? I mean, in
oh
1947,
yeah, yeah.
everything is
Oh yeah.
everything
Sorry,
is up in
47.
air. Like Taiwan actually became more important as Chiang Kai-shek lose more ground on the mainland, and eventually became his last refugee, right? And in fact, maybe we can talk about so to wrap it up, the communists scored a series of stunning victories in on mainland China, to the point that where it was not even tenable for Chiang Kai-shek to hold, like, say, the southern China south of Yangtze River, because he already lost bulk of his forces on the in the northern China. And
For some context, I want to add that when Mao declared the founding of the new People's Republic, when that happened, there were still areas of mainland China under control by the KMT, though they were very weak, and everybody knew what was going to happen. It was just a matter of when Chiang Kai-shek would
yeah, I
lose
mean,
lose his control
and
over those territories. Like Hainan wasn't liberated until the following year.
originally Mao had envisioned, maybe like a 10-year struggle in the Chinese Civil War, but the events unfolded very quickly, and almost nobody expected KMT to fall so quickly in 1949. Everything was getting wrapped up, and at that point, it was obvious to anyone that there's no way the KMT will be able to hold any ground on the mainland. It's just a matter of time. And at the time, it was there might also be the thinking on Taiwan itself, because you know um, after the 228 incident, actually just before the 228 incident on Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party sent its representative to Taiwan in 1946, just a 1 year before 228 incident. And this is Cai Xiaoqian, and he's one of the few Taiwanese communists that went to mainland, and he actually was the only Taiwanese that participated in the Long March. So he had a lot of credit, with the Chinese Communist within the Chinese Communist Party. So he was sent as its head representative to organize the underground resistance in Taiwan and to prepare Taiwan for eventual liberation. But by 1940, around 1948, 1940, so there were a series of crackdown in Taiwan, especially as Chiang Kai-shek realized that's gonna be his last refuge, right? And there was
He was already unpopular there, so let's see how well that turns out.
yeah, there was massive arrest of Taiwanese students, and
Yeah,
then this led to basically more people resenting the KMT rules, and many people are joining the communist underground because the communists at the time were probably the best organized. There were various people who resent the KMT rules, but the communists were probably just the best organized group. And
Yeah, and I think the audience will realize this as we go on and really give concrete examples of this unfolding. And I want to add that Chiang Kai-shek, a lot of people nowadays for some reason associate like Taiwan independence with Chiang Kai-shek, which is very odd considering he was very against Taiwan independence or even the notion of two Chinas. He saw like the so-called ROC and the PRC as two competing entities that represented the same China. And but because of the mishandling of all these contradictions, he certainly did set the stage for the Taiwan independence movement to kind of kick off in like a
I
few
mean,
decades.
Chiang Kai-shek, he's a Chinese nationalist. That's his
Yeah.
basically guiding ideology. And
So he was not the ideal puppet for the US because he had too many of his own
well,
ideas.
yeah, he's always his own bastard, right? I mean, he's nobody's master but his
Yeah.
own. He had always
Yes.
he's always on the lookout for himself to maximize his own power, and that's why he had such a difficult working relationship with Vinegar Joe Stilwell in World War II, because like he was not as malleable, right? He's always have his own calculus how to squeeze the most out of his relationship with US to bolster his own standing. And so some people in US didn't like that. Some people in the State Department didn't like that. And
So basically can we just jump to 1949 or
yeah,
like when his when the national army when the so-called ROC government relocated to Taiwan and brought over like a whole new wave of people.
just wanted
So
to cover a couple more events. So in 19
okay. Wait, you cover it real quick. I'm going to go to the bathroom.
Okay. So in
Drank a lot of tea.
1946, the Chinese communists send in the Taiwanese communist Cai Xiaoqian back to Taiwan. So Taiwan actually had its own communist party back in the days when Taiwan was a colony of Japan. Originally, the Taiwanese Communist Party was under the direct supervision of the Japanese Communist Party. But many the Taiwanese communists, for obvious cultural reasons, they went to mainland China to study and to work with the Chinese communists on the mainland. One of which was this person Cai Xiaoqian. As I mentioned, he actually was sent to the Mao's communist base in Jiangxi, where he participated in the Long March. So by 1946, he was sent back to Taiwan to organize the underground resistance. And as after the 228 incident in 1947, so that's February 22nd, a lot of the intellectuals and a lot of anti-AMT elements in Taiwan went to seek out guidance, from the Taiwanese Communist Party, because they're the best organized group. And as a result, the Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, as he was losing the civil war on the mainland, he started a series of crackdown on Taiwan, and one of them is so-called the 4-6 incident, when there was the KMT government just started mass arrest college students who had been staging anti-hunger strike. Some of these student movement are of course led by the communists, but you know Chiang Kai-shek just wanted to make sure Taiwan would be secure as his base. And after the series of crackdown, the the Chinese Communist Party's designated leader on Taiwan, Cai Xiaoqian, was arrested, and he was turned into a defector eventually, because his relationship with with his own sister-in-law. The KMT intelligence agency used that relationship to turn him, and he, because of his defection, the entire Chinese Communist underground network in Taiwan was uprooted, and this made, in a way, made Taiwan secure. As for movies, there was a Chinese mainland and Taiwan co-production movie called The Knot, in Chinese called 云水谣. It's based on the autobiography of of the Taiwanese communist uh, who made back to mainland after, after this Chiang Kai-Shek's White Terror. And I personally find the movie interesting, particularly the first half, because it really presented like the idealized version of the Taiwan countryside before 1947. Oh, by the way, it's based on the autobiography of Taiwanese communist Zhang Kehui, who happened to be like the uh, highest ranking Taiwanese member of the Chinese Communist Party currently. He was another native Taiwanese student who joined the Communist Party, and as a result of Chiang Kai-shek's White Terror, he had to leave Taiwan and fled to mainland. And and but while Chiang Kai-shek was continuing his crackdown, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was making headways on mainland. Very quickly, they swept across the Yangtze River, captured the KMT capital Nanjing, and advanced further south. The advance was very rapid. The KMT line was collapsing everywhere. Everybody at this point thought, uh, all of China will be liberated. So the Chinese third, I believe it's yeah, I believe the Third Field Army of PLA swept into Fujian province, which is just on the other side of Taiwan. Where most of the so-called local Taiwanese people originally came from. They then start uh, capturing the island of Xiamen and Jinmen. Now, if you remember from our first episode, we talk about Xiamen and Jinmen as these two islands off the coast of Fujian. That used to be the headquarters of the Chinese pirates slash national hero Koxinga, aka Zheng Cenggong, right? Zheng Cenggong, aka Koxinga, actually originally launched from his base in Xiamen and Jinmen across the Taiwan Strait to kick out the Dutch out of Taiwan and to establish his own power base in Taiwan. So this time, as a prelude to what looks to be liberation of Taiwan, the PLA launched the Battle of Xiamen. They very quickly captured Xiamen, and then they launched an invasion of Jinmen Island, which just lay across the waters. Xiamen and Jinmen, they're both islands, and they're both very have been historically very important trade hubs. And another
We'll get into Jinmen in a lot more detail later today.
another
By the
name
way,
for shaman, as we talk about in English, is a moi, which is transcribed from the Hokkien language, and for
not quite. I think it's the other
I'm
way
sorry,
around. I think it's is it? I thought it was the other
what's
way
over here?
around because in Hokkien it's emun. I'm not sure if it's directly transliterated because in Hokkien it's emun.
Okay, no, I mean no, it's well, it's originally from Portuguese, right? Like the
Oh, so
Portuguese.
yeah, and then Jinmen was also called.
Yeah,
Quemoy.
because the Portuguese got their name from the Hokkien, right, and then the English got it from the Portuguese. So the name was
Oh,
corrupted
okay.
several times already. But as a note for the American audience, the original Boston Tea Party that sparks the American Revolution, the tea that tossed into Boston Harbor came from Xiamen, from Amoy, and
And while we're on that topic, I want to mention when Chiang Kai-Shek retreated to Taiwan, he remembered history, and the Dutch were unable to stop Zheng Chenggong from defeating them. And then afterwards, the remnants of the Ming dynasty on Taiwan were unable to stop the Qing from defeating them as well. So Chiang rightly felt that history was going to repeat himself, and that he was basically fucked.
yes, and in 1949, the PLA quickly took over Xiamen in a, um, I think in like 1 day long battle, and then they went on to try to capture Jinmen Island. But
Their plan was to retake Taiwan in 1950.
right, so because like Xiamen and Jinmen, they are kind of springboard, even though they're offshore islands of Fujian, but that has always been like the kind of like the gateway, so to speak, to Taiwan.
To the Taiwan
But
Strait. Yeah.
but the PLA commanders got a little bit overconfident after the capture.
They were dizzy with success, in Comrade Stalin's
Yes,
words.
because they quickly captured so much, a huge swath of China. They were able to capture very important trade port of Xiamen, and then Jinmen is just it looks like it's about to fall.
You can see it from
I'm
Xiamen.
sorry.
You can see it from Xiamen. Yeah, like I often say, I've seen Jinmen, but I've never been
But
there.
but the thing is, the PLA at this point didn't really have a navy, so they had to rely on like literally fishing boats wooden fishing boats to ship their soldiers across the sea to take over the Jinmen Island. And what they're not familiar, because this troop that come from the north, right? They put cross the Yangtze River and quickly pushed down into southern China. They're unfamiliar with the tide of the region, and and the invasion of Jinmen was organized so hastily that when they uh, when they landed the first wave of troops, because of the shifting tide, the boats couldn't get back, couldn't go back to Xiamen, and further supply and bring reinforcement. In effect, it got the troops that landed on Jinmen got cut off, and the KMT at the time, they still have modern warships, basically from the American land lease. But they have a real navy, right? So in a surprising turn, the KMT decided to make a stand at Jinmen, and they quickly cut off the reinforcement from mainland to Jinmen, and trapped the PLA forces that already made the landing. And this is one of the few KMT victories in 1949, like a surprising KMT victory, and this somehow was always hailed by KMT as like their, I don't know, kind of like the saving grace, if you will, that somehow saved the
It was a morale
exactly,
booster.
exactly, because from in 1949, KMT suffered defeat after defeat, and this kind of minor battle of Jinmen became a big propaganda victory, basically.
Yeah. So while we're on this topic, I want to tie this into the political development of Taiwan, and to do that, I'm going to provide a little bit of I guess international context. So basically, logically, the next step was the liberation of Taiwan, but the PLA had some setbacks. Like Carl said, there was no navy. The PLA didn't really have a mature air force. So a delegation headed by You Shaoqi yeah, the dude who was targeted during the Cultural Revolution, went to Moscow to meet Stalin, and he basically asked Stalin for 200 planes and some training, but Stalin said no because the Soviet Union had already suffered great losses during World War II, and he really didn't want to risk war with the U.S. So, but as we mentioned Korea earlier, because if you think about it, Taiwan is pretty far from the Soviet border, but Korea isn't. So though Stalin was quite reluctant to promise much to China regarding Taiwan, he had a very different attitude towards Korea since it had a greater geopolitical impact on the Soviet Union. So in 1949, he promised Kim Il Sung that if war broke out in Korea, that the Soviet Union would deliver material aid. Now, this is very important because 1950 is when the year that the PLA planned on liberating Taiwan, and it's also, as we can see, as we know now, the year that the Korean War started. So basically, Kim Il Sung went to Beijing to talk to Mao about this in early 1950, and I really want to say that it's it's a complicated issue on who began the Korean War, but it's not the simple matter of the KPA launching a surprise attack on June 25th, 1950. But anyways, um, they knew that war was probably going to happen soon. So I talk about this because the Chinese and Korean communists formed a very great bond during their war against Japan, and Mao also understood the geopolitical implications of war in Korea because, like I mentioned in the previous episode, Korea has always been the bridge into China by imperialists. So Mao's main concern at this point was if war broke out in Korea before Taiwan was liberated, then the US's attitude towards Taiwan would change. Because keep in mind, at this point in 1949, the US, most Truman was basically determined to give up on Taiwan, whereas MacArthur thought that it was important to, you know, maintain support towards Chiang Kai-Shek. And this contradiction between the two is plays an important role in the fate of Taiwan, which is probably what we're going to talk about
And
next,
another thing
right?
about Korean War, side note, is that in the beginning, actually, both North and South were planning on war to reunify Korea. Not just Kim Il Sung was planning to unify Korea by force, but also from the South Korean side.
Well, obviously, it's one
Yeah,
country.
yeah. They what's the South Korean president at the time?
Syngman
Simon
Rhee,
Rhee, he was also planning.
Lee
He
Chung
was
Wan.
also planning to reunify Korea by force, and both sides were building up their military forces. And what gave the DPRK the military edge was actually Mao agreed to Kim Il Sung's request to send him uh, three divisions of the Korean soldiers serving in the PLA because like during the Chinese Civil War, Manchuria was a major theater of war, and as a result of the history with the Japanese invasion, there was a large scale Korean migration into Manchuria. There were about 3 to 4 million Koreans living in Manchuria at the end of World War II, and many of them participated in the Chinese Civil War. They were recruited in the PLA, and so that's how you ended up with 40 30 to 40,000 Koreans in the PLA, and the Kim Il Sung specifically asked Mao for those forces. So Mao agreed and basically sent these you can say Chinese Korean units that bolsters the force of DPRK to over 100,000, and to give them the edge and the manpower, to push south. Uh, that that is just a digression. So
Yeah, so let's get back to Chiang Kai-shek's uncertainty of his fate in the Korean War, because we're at this is like the perfect time to talk about that, and and chronologically this is where it would fit
Yes,
in.
because
So basically,
go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
Chiang Kai-shek knew that he was pretty much screwed, so he sent one of his generals, Li Zibai, to mainland China to have final talks with the communists. He picked him because Li Zibai's younger sister was Chen Yi's sister-in-law, General Chen Yi in the PLA. So basically, what he said was anything was negotiable under the condition that the communists would not put their boots on Taiwan. And this went on as the Korean War was about to begin. And remember, the Korean War started in June 25th of 1950. In mid-June, 10 days before the Korean War broke out, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Johnson and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Bradley brought a note back from MacArthur, which it basically went over the military significance of Taiwan and why the communists cannot have it. So you basically have the Aleutian Islands, a chain of islands from the Aleutian Islands to the Mariana Islands. And that's one of the U.S.'s chains of defense or
They call
aggression,
it the first,
depending on how you look
yeah,
at
the
it.
first island chain and the second island chain.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Now, Taiwan, geographically, it was nearest of all of the islands in the Pacific. It was closest to both Okinawa and the Philippines, both of which are under U.S. control, which means Taiwan is the perfect aircraft carrier, so to speak. It can't move, but it also can't sink. So if Taiwan were lost, this comprehensive defense network, or as I like to call it, the network of aggression, would be broken, and basically the U.S. would lose control of a good chunk of the Pacific Ocean. Now, if the U.S. were to shift its attitude towards Taiwan, it would also create a new problem. Because when Truman thought of giving up Chiang Kai-shek, there wasn't really much thought of, two Chinas or one Taiwan, one China, whatever. But if the U.S. decided to shift it, then it would at least de facto, it would create a de facto situation of two Chinas, and also challenge the status. It would also challenge the status of the PRC and how the U.S. is to approach its relationship with Taiwan and the so-called ROC. And although Chiang Kai-shek was in a precarious situation, he still could not accept the creation of two Chinas or an independent Taiwan. And the foreign minister, Ye Gongchao, stated that the so-called ROC stance was the preservation of China's territorial integrity, and that Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. So at that point, I mean, this is still the official position, but it's not actively pursued anymore in Taiwan. So at that point, the situation was the official position of both governments that were actually being carried out, because there's still the official position. Now just Taiwan's not really actively pursuing it. So it's similar to the two Korean governments, which is both the DPRK and the so-called ROK consider themselves to be the sole legitimate representative of the Korean Peninsula. It's just that part of their own territory is occupied by the enemies, but they're still domestic enemies, not foreign enemies. So from the standpoint of Chinese sovereignty, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek were in agreement. They just disagreed on which government was the legitimate representative of the same China. So therefore, as the U.S. was kind of doing this behind the back of Chiang Kai-shek was pretty pissed off, because to justify this, they began really pushing the undetermined status of Taiwan rhetoric. So at this time, Chiang Kai-shek told his intelligence agents to just keenly observe the situation on Korea, and also the moves that the U.S. forces in Japan were making. And as soon as the Korean War broke out, Syngman Rhee hit up Chiang Kai-shek. It was on the midnight of June 26th. So basically, not even 24 hours after the Korean War broke out, Chiang Kai-shek ordered his military to be ready for war. and he told his son Jiang Jingo to tell General Li Zibai, the guy who he sent to the mainland to negotiate with the communists, to end all negotiations. So you can see a shift in attitude. He went from a position of weakness all of a sudden to a position of confidence. Now, MacArthur, Bradley Johnson, and the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, Collins, did not see the Korean War as a civil war between North and South Korea, but a war between U.S. interests and communists. So they hastily drew up a plan, which was to assist South Korea or to assist the South Korean army immediately with the help of Chiang Kai-shek's troops, and to reiterate the importance of Taiwan to U.S. interests and defend it from the communists. Because remember, at this time, Truman was still kind of not on board with that. And they also wanted to build up the strength of the pro-U.S. forces in the Philippines and Indochina, and also safeguard Japan for obvious reasons. So why is this significant? Because Chiang Kai-shek hoped that the Korean War could turn into World War III, so that he could recapture the mainland with the help of the U.S. So he hit up MacArthur and Syngman Rhee, saying that he'll send the 52nd Army, consisting of 33,000 people, to fight in Korea. And Atchison was firmly against this plan, saying that Taiwan should not be left unprotected, and that Chiang Kai-shek's troops weren't necessarily better than South Korean soldiers. And if the South Koreans really needed help, the U.S. might as well just send material aid to the South Korean army. And but then Johnson said that sending troops over after the 7th Fleet had entered the Taiwan Strait would be doable. Yes?
Yeah, I just would like to mention that speaking of Chiang Kai-shek offering to send troops to Korea, even though it didn't materialize,
He did the same in Vietnam, by the way.
even though it didn't materialize, but inexplicably, after the Korean War got under the way, then U.S. got the UN to declare, basically to send the so-called UN forces to Korea to push back against the communist forces, and basically the UN forces consist of U.S. client states and proxies all across the world, and one of the participants was Turkey, and there was a Turkish brigade that participated in the Korea War, and in the Turkish War Museum on Korean War, there's an inexplicably displayed of the Republic of China flag that supposedly that they captured in Korea. And this was become like an internet meme on the Chinese social media, because it became a laughing stock, because like how do they think they captured the Republic of China flag in Korea, right? Because yeah.
It could be from the Chinese diaspora community there,
but it was presented as like a kind of like the
like a war
yeah,
trophy.
war trophy by the Turkish brigade. But anyway, so that was just a fun diversion.
Yeah.
Back to the story, please.
So then, at this time, Chiang Kai-shek sent his ambassador, what's his face, Gu Weijun, right? Is that his name? No.
I mean, the real thing was that U.S. decision to send in 7th Fleet into Taiwan Strait, right? Which at the time the communist China did not have a navy. That they could not ferry
Yeah, yeah.
troops.
No, I wasn't finished with
Sorry,
that thought. They sent his he sent his ambassador Gu Weijun, and also this intellectual Hu Shi, to the White House to talk this plan over. And Truman actually liked it. Yes, and what were you saying? Yeah, and then I was asking what you were saying before, because I think we broke up.
oh, I was just saying, the important fact was that U.S. sending the Seventh Fleet into Taiwan Strait, and that
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
basically, is U.S. for the first time directly intervened in the Chinese Civil War, preventing PLA from crossing Taiwan Strait and going on to liberate Taiwan, and that
Yeah. Okay, we're going to talk about how that plays an important role in the Battle of Jinmen.
yeah, yeah, but that happened after the Korean
Oh
after the
yeah, yeah,
Korean War.
yeah. But I'm just putting everything into context. I like to remind
Yeah,
the
yeah,
listener
yeah.
that hey, pay attention to this because it's going to come up again.
Yes, because the first battle of Jinmen was happened in 1949 when immediately after PLA captured Xiamen, they tried to capture Jinmen, but this effort was a big setback. But keep in mind,
Anyways, the sequel is better, is what we're trying to say.
in 1949, 1950s, the KMT still control a large swath of offshore islands of China. So anywhere from Zhejiang down to Hainan Islands, the KMT controlled almost all the offshore islands, primarily because KMT at the time had a navy, the PLA didn't, and they have an air force, so they were able to station a large force in Zhoushan Island, just offshore from Zhejiang, including Dacen Dao that you mentioned earlier.
We're gonna get to that soon, actually, today, because I'm going to put everything into context because all of this relates with Taiwan's status and the relationship between the in the Communist Party, the KMT, and the
Yes, and
U.S.
speaking of which, at the time, even the attitude among many captured KMT generals in Beijing, many of them who wrote memoirs years later, they actually talk about the time when Korea War first broke out in 1950. They thought that was a turning point. They were sitting in the POW camp, in Beijing, and they were cheering when the news of Korean War broke out because they thought that was a chance for KMT to stage a comeback and to retake take mainland China, because they thought there's no way that the PLA would be able to stand up to the U.S. military force on land. And but to their surprise, Korea,
To their surprise, Korea is mostly mountains, and guess what? The PLA is really good at fighting in the mountains.
and also, the it's also the U.S. under MacArthur seriously underestimated the capability of PLA. I mean, which is understandable because PLA at the time was a mostly a peasant force carrying small arms. They didn't have sophisticated logistic lines. They only have what they can carry on their bodies. Usually sometimes the supplies only last a week or two, but despite.
Yeah, we're gonna get into this in a lot more detail.
Okay,
If we when we
okay,
go on,
let's get there. Go ahead. I'm the mic is
yeah.
to you.
I'm just trying to keep everything in chronological order so we don't jump around too
Okay.
much because this is like kind of we understand the context, but I feel like a lot of our audience
Yes,
don't.
yes,
So I'm trying to. I hope to keep it as simple for them as possible or like
yes, yes.
followable. So yeah. So basically, the Korean People's Army liberates Seoul on the 28th of the 28th of June. So yeah, 3 days. 3 days after crossing the 38th parallel, they liberate Seoul. So MacArthur determines that the South Korean army is fucked and that it needs U.S. intervention. And he also tries to convince Truman to give Chiang Kai-Shek the green light. So then Atchison convinces Truman to say no to Chiang, and if Jiang sends his troops to that if His reasoning was that if Chiang Kai-shek sends his troops to Korea, then Beijing will certainly get involved, and that would expand the scope of the Korean War, and it'll be unpopular with the US's allies and isolate the US. Now, this is exactly what Chiang Kai-shek and MacArthur want, though. So you can see kind of the disagreements between all of these different parties. Now, Truman says that Chiang Kai-shek's forces are to remain in Taiwan and not engage with any military action with the Chinese mainland. So Mao tells us General Chen Yi to start liberating the aforementioned offshore islands in the southeast. So on July 1st, the PLA liberates a bunch of islands. And so then on 4 days later, on July 5th, this is all in 1950, by the way, the U.S. sends a fleet of F-80 planes to Taiwan. And around this time, the KMT realizes that the U.S. is only patrolling the strait and preventing the PLA from going to Taiwan, but it has no intention of helping the KMT defend those islands off the coast of mainland China. So just as Chiang Kai-shek was prepared to retreat from Jinmen, MacArthur told Chiang that he's ready to help fight communists. So once again, Chiang Kai-shek orders his people on Jinmen to stop the retreat and stay there. And Mao knew that the PLA would not be able to defeat the U.S. Navy or Air Force because, they didn't have a Navy. So on August 11th, Mao told Chen Yi to stop activities in, the offshore islands. And then less than 2 weeks later, on August 20th, the Korean People's Army pushes South Korean forces all the way to Busan, which is in the southeast of Korea, and they begin carrying out land reforms and holding elections in the liberated areas. And then 10 days later, the Battle of Busan breaks out, and there was a problem because it was so far south that the supply line was like 300 kilometers. So the UN forces started bombing the supply line, and that results in a stalemate. And then, as you know, September 15th, MacArthur lands in Incheon. And then after that, on August 1st, the U.S. authorities in Tokyo tell Comrade Kim Il-sung to surrender. So 2 days later, Kim Il-sung reaches out to China for assistance. And, why did he reach out to China? Because of the promises that we talked about earlier. So then around this time, Zhou Enlai tells the Indian ambassador to China to tell the U.S., because remember, the U.S. didn't have an embassy in mainland China. So they tell the Indian ambassador to tell the U.S. that if the U.S. crosses the 38th parallel, then China is not just going to sit by and let it happen. So guess what happens on August 4th? The UN forces cross the 38th parallel. And then within a few days, the U.S. starts bombing the Yalu River Bridge and what is today Dandong, which is that city that's right across from Siniju and the DPRK.
If you go to the China-North Korean border today in Dandong, you can still see the half-bombed-out bridge.
There's two bridges. So one of the bridges was repaired, and that's the bridge that you use to cross into the DPRK, whether you go by train or by bus. So I got to travel across that bridge. But then they left the other bridge just kind of the way it was after it got bombed as like a reminder of the Korean War. And it's now not a huge, but it's a tourist attraction in Dandong. Dandong's a pretty small city. There's not too much to do. So one of the things to do is to go look at North Korea. And take boats along the Yalu River. And anyways, the Chinese Central Committee decides that resisting U.S. imperialism and aiding Korea was to take precedence over liberating Taiwan, because assisting Korea was doable, whereas liberating Taiwan was kind of hard without a navy or a good air force. So the 9th Army Corps was sent from southeast China to northern China. Those are the people who were, training to liberate Taiwan. So October 19th, U.S. occupies Pyongyang, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army crosses the Yalu River into Korea. It's called the Volunteer Army and not Liberation Army because Mao did not want to, declare war with the UN. So, yeah. at this time in the U.S., the Democrats lose the midterm election, and Truman needed to end the Korean War to help maintain his popularity. So Truman and Atchison were looking for ways in the U.S. to save face, but also end full-blown war in Korea. And at that point, they pretty much settled on just keeping half of Korea. They thought that maintaining half of Korea under U.S. control was better than none in terms of U.S. public opinion and geopolitics. I mean, a total retreat like what happened in Vietnam would have been the humiliating defeat. I mean, it would have been really funny on our part, but I guess from the U.S. perspective, not so much. So Truman decided to limit the war in Korea and to stop sending more troops to Korea. And the goal was just to keep the front line at the 38th parallel while reaching an armistice agreement. And this process took like almost 3 years. So for like the latter part of the Korean War, it was mostly just like along the 38th parallel. And meanwhile, MacArthur wanted to expand the battlefield from Korea to the rest of Asia and, in his words, eradicate communism in Asia. And Chiang Kai-Shek was willing to send 500,000 troops to Korea. Now, MacArthur was ready to bomb northeast China and then enter China with Chiang Kai-Shek. But this was in violation of Truman's decision to end the Korean War. So Truman was fired. So MacArthur was fired by Truman.
MacArthur not only proposed to bomb northeast China, he actually proposed to use about 30 nuclear weapons, basically to cut off Manchuria from North Korea by turning the border into like a radioactive lake. Of course, his crazy plan was vetoed by Truman because Truman didn't want to escalate.
Was he crazy? Like the Soviet Union already had an atomic bomb, so I mean,
yeah, exactly. So Truman didn't want to escalate a limited theater war like Korean War into like World War III. So he was overruled, and MacArthur eventually got fired for insubordination.
But then he still bluffed because but Truman still did play the nuclear card, but he was bluffing. He because after MacArthur was fired by Truman, there were negotiations, and Zhou Enlai's condition for ending Chinese involvement in the Korean War was for the UN to recognize the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government of China and to kick out the so-called Republic of China. The other was that the U.S. forces must leave Taiwan. So these two, you can see, are pretty much in the Shanghai Communique of 1972. And then the third condition was that all foreign forces must leave Korea. So then Truman retaliated by saying, if the People's Volunteer Army crosses the 38th parallel, he'll drop nukes. So then on December 31st of 1950, the People's Volunteer Army crosses the 38th parallel and captures Seoul, and no nukes were dropped. So we find out that Truman was bluffing. So Mao's attitude was, if Truman meant it, he would have done it already. But although Mao wasn't shook by Truman, Europeans did get shook because they didn't want to die in Asia for Americans. And Churchill in Britain thought that if war expanded in Asia, it would weaken Europe's defense capabilities. But then on the other end of this debate, you had Chiang Kai-Shek, who did not want to end the Korean War, and he was pretty mad about Truman not letting him enter Korea. So then, this goes on, and then Eisenhower was elected in 1952. Chiang Kai-Shek told Eisenhower on February 1st of 1953 that the first step of ending the Korean War is to carry out 反攻大陆, which was roughly translates to counterattack on the mainland, or like the recapture of the mainland. And Chiang Kai-Shek's plan was to open up a second theater, but Eisenhower promised the American people that he'd end the Korean War. But Eisenhower does tell Chiang Kai-Shek that he's free to act as he pleases in the Taiwan Strait. So on February 6th, the U.S. government declares an end to its Taiwan neutrality policy. And if Chiang Kai-shek were to launch an attack against mainland China, the Seventh Fleet would not stop him. I mean, he didn't say that like the U.S. Army would go help him fight in the mainland, but they wouldn't stop him. So then around this time, the U.S. sends a bunch of F-84 Thunderjets to Taiwan in June. This was in 1953, and on July 17th, 10 days before the armistice was signed in Korea, which was July 27th, Chiang Kai-shek starts a bombing campaign on Dongsan Island, which is off the shore of Fujian. But then he gets crushed by the PLA in 2 days. But then this leads to the kind of the one of the most important points in regards to Taiwan status and all that in the 1950s. So you want to add any comment while we transition from the Korean War to the battles? I mean, I think at this time we can talk about some of Chiang Kai-shek's policies in Taiwan, just so people kind of know what's going on inside Taiwan as well.
Yeah, can you just briefly talk about that while I go to the bathroom? All right,
Okay.
Go ahead. Mike is yours.
Okay, so basically the KMT carried out land reform, which happened from 1949 to 1953. So it pretty much got rid of the big landlord class as a political force. Now, if you remember the last episode, Taiwan's class structure after World War II was pretty much, you have, it was like an agrarian society. You had proletarian workers, and you also had like a big landlord class, but there was not much of a national bourgeoisie. So because of colonial arrangements, the wealthy landlord class wasn't the ruling class of Taiwan. It was more of like the middle management for the Japanese imperialists. So, I forgot to add I think this doesn't need to be said, but there was a highly unequal distribution of land in Taiwan, and Chiang Kai-shek figured that he needed to solve that problem because that was part of why he got kicked out of the mainland. Anyways, the old ruling class, being the middle management for the Japanese people, was kind of more or less continued by the KMT, but except this time as middle management for the KMT because
So you wanna
yeah.
basically take it all the way to Battle of Jinmen, 1958, right?
Oh, I just kind of want to go over that too because I didn't expect this to take this long. I didn't expect like that much, background
Yeah.
information. So
Let's do that.
but
Let's take it to Battle of Jinmen. I don't know if we'll get to the John Jingo era. Today.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
at this rate, I don't think we're gonna
Yeah.
get there. But basically, Chiang Kai-shek during this time was carrying out land reform, and then there was a lot of industrial assets from the Japanese that were confiscated by the so-called ROC government, and then you got parts of the deposed landlord class that was transformed into urban capitalists by compensating them with industrial property or shares in state enterprises. So if you see like some middle class people in Taiwan today who have like just for some reason like their families have like shares of all of these companies that used to be owned by the state in Taiwan, this is part of the reason. So like in South Korea, the so-called ROC government on Taiwan control the allocation of US aid and the allocation of licenses and foreign exchange necessary for access to international markets. And I guess where Chiang Kai-shek and Park Chung-hee differed was Park Chung-hee nourished a small group of chaebol, which is taifa, how would I say it in English? Conglomerates. While Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was more or less the direct control over a number of big enterprises and heavy industry, while showing a little bit less favoritism when it came to granting credit and licenses to the private sector, which explains why Taiwan has such a big small business. What is it? No, small to medium has so many small to medium businesses that are that run parallel to the giant state enterprises. And we're gonna get to this later on because part of the liberalization process was also the privatization of these industries.
I don't know
So
if you talk about it while I was gone, but 'cause the reason KMT were able to carry out land reform, which they wouldn't be able to do on the mainland, is a couple reasons. When KMT was losing mainland, they knew what the problem was. They knew the PLA and the Chinese Communists had the support of the peasantry for a very simple reason, because the communists were carrying out land reform in the liberated areas by taking away the land from the landlord and redistributing them to the tenant farmers. But much of the KMT's political support came from the landlord class, right? So they obviously cannot take away the land from the landlord class and distribute it to the poor peasant by destroying.
whereas Taiwan was had a more or less a clean slate.
Exactly. When they went to Taiwan, because the support of Chiang Kai-Shek resides in his control of military, all these of his mainland troops, the troops he brought from the mainland, right? He is not tied with the landlord class in Taiwan. In fact,
Yep.
he was able to do whatever he wanted in Taiwan, because his political support does not come from the Taiwanese landlord class. So that's why he can apply the lesson he learned on mainland to Taiwan without the political baggage that he had on mainland itself.
But it did cause problems down the road because if you look at the people in the DPP today, the Democratic Progressive Party, which it began as a opposition movement against the KMT in the 1980s. But basically, a lot of the people in that party who ended up taking power are descendants of that landlord class.
Yes.
Like Tsai Ing-wen, like the current leader of Taiwan, she comes from that sort of background, and because of the poor handling of the I guess the groups of people in Taiwan, it did there was not only class conflict but also like provincial conflict between mainlanders and the Taiwanese people that later would make the KMT suffer a huge blow. Now during this time, Chiang Kai-shek carried out certain policies like for example, compulsory education and all that stuff, but he also enforced speaking Mandarin in school, for example. Whereas in mainland China, the introduction of Mandarin Chinese, standard Mandarin, was kind of a more natural process, and people started speaking it more when talking to people from different parts of China. In Taiwan, it was even until the 80s. If you spoke any other dialect than Mandarin, you would this is kids we're talking about. You would get fined money.
Wow. I mean, like,
And then you would, and then there was,
I mean,
yeah,
like, yeah. It was shocking to me to hear that in Taiwan there were back in the days there were corporal punishment in classrooms for students, speaking other than Mandarin. Because I'm from China, right? I was educated until I was 13 years old in 1980s China, on the mainland. And for us, I grew up speaking the Chongqing dialect, and it's we would speak Mandarin in classrooms, but after class, outside class during the break in school, we still speak our dialect. The only time we would literally use Mandarin is when class is in session. Between recess and everything, we revert back to our dialect. So it was kind of shocking for me to hear that they had this draconian measures in Taiwan to enforce speaking Mandarin.
yeah. And then you have also have funny stories because on TV there were 3 TV stations, and then they also had this sort of requirement that there needed to be a quota of how much Mandarin, how many shows and programs were in Mandarin per day. So then you would see funny situations because you had some TV shows that were in Hokkien, but then all of a sudden, like just for no reason, starting from a certain episode, they just all the characters just started speaking broken Mandarin. Because I mean, a lot of the actors didn't speak Mandarin well.
Yeah, I was mentioning the movie, the mainland Taiwan co-production, Yun Shui Yao, the Knot. It was I find the first half of the movie interesting because it kind of show the Taiwan in the transition period, post handover and before 228, right? And then the only gripe I have against that movie is nobody
Mandarin speaking too well.
nobody no characters in that story should be speaking Mandarin in 1947 Taiwan. These are not the people who came from mainland to Taiwan. These are the Taiwanese people in Taiwan.
That's my major gripe with mainland productions, because like if you go to like the countryside in mainland China, most people speak standard Mandarin with heavy
Yes,
accents.
yes,
Maybe might not be that heavy, but it's quite
yes.
noticeable. But like in TV, a lot of TV shows, like even in like the most remote regions, like they all speak standard Mandarin like much better than either of us
Yes.
do.
Yes.
I'm just like, no, that's bullshit.
Yes, yes. Yes, they speak like they're born and raised in Beijing all their lives.
Yeah. So then Chiang Kai-Shek, other policies include, like I think I mentioned this. He wanted to prevent the rise of like working class movements. So then so then the KMT allowed labor unions to form, but they had to be basically under control of the KMT, and like the general secretary, the board of directors, and all that had to be members of the KMT. And then eventually, like I think within 3 years of these unions forming, like almost a fourth of the members joined the party. So basically, Chiang Kai-Shek had the bourgeoisie in his pockets. He also had the working class in his pockets. There wasn't much of a middle class
Yeah,
at
I
that
also
point to speak of. But then that would change, and then that would be an important detail, because the KMT didn't really prepare itself against opposition from the petty
yeah,
bourgeoisie, which they the petty bourgeoisie is anti-communist, partly because I mean they think they're bourgeois, but also because of decades of anti-communist education. Oh, another thing, during this time, Chiang Kai-Shek was a lot of the soldiers in the National Army were brought to Taiwan against their wills,
yes.
and there was always the promise that, okay, this is just temporary. We're gonna go back to mainland China in no time. So then Chiang Kai-Shek really had to up that sort of propaganda. So for quite a while, there were like signs and slogans all over the streets saying stuff like like 杀猪拔毛反共抗俄反攻大陆 and stuff like that. Which is like kill Zhu and eradicate Mao, stand up against communism and stay opposed to Russia, and we're going to recapture the mainland. They had all that, and then there were also slogans. Have you heard of the 反攻大陆 plan? Like the slogans for
No.
that? 一年准备. So year one, we prepare for a year. 二年反攻. So second year we launched the counterattack. 三年扫荡. Third year we sweep the communists away.
Wow.
五年成功. So he had a 5-year plan of retaking the mainland, but he knew it was bullshit. But it was basically to keep the soldiers that he tricked to Taiwan to
Yeah.
rise up against him, because soldiers being pissed off at you was a very bad idea.
For people who are not familiar with this period of China, the KMT army is not a volunteer army. Okay, it's a conscription based army. Like the people were literally a press gang into join the army back back on the mainland. Even during the
There were some that joined voluntarily. A lot of them during the war against
yes,
Japan. So a lot of them voluntarily joined because they love their country. They wanted to fight the Japanese. But then when the Civil War got really desperate in the 40s, but you hear a lot of stories like the parents would send their kids to go buy soy sauce and then they would never go home because they got kidnapped by the army.
Yes, yes, and this also happened along like we talk about the KMT control a lot of the offshore islands of China. And when the KMT finally evacuated, they forced basically the civilian population to go with them.
Yeah, we're gonna get into that with Da Chen because that might be when we talk about the Battle of Jinmen. That was every single person on this one island was brought over to Taiwan
Also, I
in
like to
1955.
point out a lot of the new economic policies that Chiang Kai-Shek carried out in Taiwan was kind of supervised by his son, John Jingo. And
Who was educated in the Soviet
exactly.
Union.
Jiang Jingguo was sent to Soviet Union in 1920s in the 1920s when the KMT was still officially cooperating with Soviet Union and it was basically being financed and supported by the Soviet Union. So Jiang Jingguo was sent over to study in Soviet Union, and but then then 1927, his dad, Chiang Kai-shek, carried out the purge of communists in Shanghai. And then Jiang Jingguo was kind of stuck, and he actually lived in, I think he lived over for more than, he lived over a decade in Soviet Union. He was married.
Yeah, he married his wife
Yeah.
over there, Jiang
Yeah, he
Fangliang.
married,
I forgot her. Fina. Her name was
yeah,
Fina, right?
Anna,
In Russian.
she's a Belarusian, I think. And then
Yeah, she is Belarusian. So for a while, Taiwan had a Soviet so-called first
yes,
lady.
yes, and because for 10 years, Jiang Jingguo he actually joined the Communist Party of Soviet Union.
He was a trot for a little bit.
Yes, yeah, that too. Yes, and so I mean,
Fucking
he
trots.
grew up, in Soviet Union with like 5 year plans and control economy, and he basically applied what he learned partially in Taiwan. A lot.
The thing is, if you're a communist, people who extensively study, Marx and Lenin, they have a really good understanding of how power relations work and how class relations work. And I mean, if you're in a position of power and you have capital and you have all that stuff, understanding the theories of Marx makes you an even better capitalist.
Yes, yes, yes. So okay, so let's go rush toward Battle of Jinmen, the climax of our show.
Okay, so look, scrolling through my notes. Okay, so 1952 is kind of like a turning point for the KMT. So we're kind of what's that word? Backtracking a little bit. U.S. aid to Taiwan increases, and an interesting anecdote is during the time of U.S. aid, there would be like bags of like I don't know, like flour or whatever, and those bags would say U.S. aid, and obviously, and then poorer families would use those bags to like make clothes for their children. So you pretty much had like little kids walking around with the words U.S. aid on their butts. And then, anyways, white terror in Taiwan was ramped up. The streets of Taipei, train stations, bus stations, all had lists of people executed by the KMT. And you didn't even have to be a communist to be executed by the KMT. You just had to be suspected of being one, or just be pretty much anti-government. You'll be called a communist for like whatever. So I mean, my uncle came up with a joke saying that when he was a kid and he didn't know the answers of a test, he would just write 三民主义统一中国, or you reunify China under the three principles of the people. And if his teacher marked him wrong, his teacher would be shot by Chiang Kai-Shek. He didn't actually do that, but yeah, I thought that was entertaining. Oh, and movie theaters back then in Taiwan were pretty interesting. Before a movie played in a movie theater, a message would show up on the screen saying 通匪者杀, or roughly translates to kill communist
Wow.
collaborators. And then from 1950 to 1954, like there was like another like kind of huge purge, and suspected or actual communists that were both 本省 or 外省, or like Taiwanese or like of mainland background, were executed or imprisoned.
Oh,
So
speaking of which, like Li Denghui, right? The later the so-called first local Taiwanese president got elected in 1990s. He in the Taiwanese election, he was he actually joined the Communist Party for a brief moment on Taiwan after.
in
Yeah,
1946,
yeah,
it was via a front group called 台湾民主自治同盟, which is how do you translate that? The I guess alliance
for democratic self
for
determination
of
or
Taiwan, yeah,
autonomy. Yeah, yeah,
which was created by Xie Xuehong, the communist woman we
yeah.
talked about
Xie
earlier,
Yong is
and it
like
was
the founder, right? Or she's the
she
founder and the leader of the Taiwanese Communist Party.
yeah, it was under the directive of the Central Committee of the Chinese
Yeah,
Communist Party.
yeah.
Yeah, and but yeah, I also have in my notes I mentioned Cai Xiaoqian. Anyways, he quits the Communist Party in 19. Li Denghui quits the Communist Party in 1947, and then Cai Xiaoqian and Li Denghui promised to each other to keep his involvement in the party a secret.
Wow.
And then Li Denghui claims that he never sold out the communists to Taiwan, but the KMT had a very comprehensive
Of course.
intelligence network, and for him to have gotten to such a high level in the KMT would have meant that Jiang Jingo, who incidentally was the head of the secret police for a while,
Huh.
would have obviously looked through his files very carefully.
Yeah.
And Jiang Jingo actually had Li Denghui tell him personally about how he joined and quit the party. So are we going to really believe that he earned Jiang Jingo and Jiang Jingo's trust without selling out the communists? Because the law back then was that anyone who has participated in a communist organization is presumed to still be an active member unless proven
Yes.
otherwise. And how do you prove otherwise? Like, your word doesn't mean shit. You have to prove through action that you're no longer a communist.
Yes.
And I think I'm gonna get into this later when we talk about more
Okay.
modern times, how he's the Judas among Judases.
Yes. Okay.
But anyways, the KMT and the US enters like this honeymoon period when Eisenhower gets elected, because Eisenhower says that the US will defend Taiwan from communist attack. So then they signed the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty, and the treaty explicitly says that only Taiwan and Penghu are under the protection of the US. Another name for Penghu, by the way, is the Pescadores. Jinmen, Mazu, and Dachen are not protected by the 7th Fleet. And there was a series of this was the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty. By the Sino over here, by the way, means the administration on Taiwan, because that was recognized by the U.S. as the legitimate government of all of China still. Now, it was a series of 3 treaties, and the other 2 are the Mutual Defense Treaty between the United States and Korea. And by Korea, they mean South Korea. And then there was also the Southeast Asian Collective Defense Treaty, which created SEATO. So Mao correctly saw that mainland China was a target of U.S. encirclement. So from 1950 until the Battle of Jinmen, the Taiwan authorities launched many attacks on mainland China from Jinmen, Mazu, and Dachen, with support from, like, tacit support from the U.S. So then in 1954, Chiang Kai-Shek sets up a commission called, 光复大陆设计研究委员会, which is the Planning Commission for the Recovery of the Mainland. He had some pretty good names for all of his, like, he had some very oddly specific commissions, I must say. So then Mao thought that it was the right time to engage, like, once again. So he tells Zhou Enlai, who was at the Geneva conference, to reiterate China's position that Taiwan is a part of China and that China must liberate Taiwan. Now we're going to see that this view kind of shifts in mainland China. Like the view that Taiwan is a part of China never changes in Beijing, but the means of reunification and their idea of reunification does change over time. Now on August 1st, the commander in chief Zhu De says that the Chiang Kai-Shek clique must be eradicated in order for Taiwan to be liberated. And the Central Committee agrees with the statement. So at this time, Beijing reiterates that the issue of Taiwan's liberation is a domestic issue of China's and that foreign powers should fuck off. And September 3rd, 1954, the so-called ROC's delegate at the UN, what's his face? Jiang Tingfu, is that his name? Yeah. Talks about how the PLA has already begun shelling Jinmen from Xiamen. And interesting side note, if you ever go to Jinmen, one thing you need to buy is a knife made there because the PLA shot so many shells over there that they had so much metal that they didn't know what to do with it. So the people who lived in Jinmen just started making knives with them.
Just going back track a little bit to support what you said about the Korean War and U.S. Seventh Fleet basically altered the plans for Taiwan, is that even though KMT control a lot of the offshore islands, by May 1950, the PLA already started to liberate the Highland Islands. The second largest island in China, right?
Yeah.
Of course, the strait separating Highland Islands and the Guangdong province is not as wide as a Highland as a Taiwan Strait, but that was kind of like a practice ground for PLA to doing the amphibious landing and to liberate a large island. But like that was immediately just before the Korean War broke out, because Korean War broke out the
Yeah.
following month in June 1950.
I think Korean volunteers were involved in the liberation of Hainan.
Yes, because Lin Biao's army, which the first field army, was originally from Manchuria. Lin Biao had almost a million army under his command in 1949 when he liberated entire Manchuria, and Lin Biao led those million men basically across the entire China, and they were responsible. The first field army, which mostly came from Manchuria, were responsible for liberating Guangdong province. Right, so they took part in liberating Guangzhou, and so Highland was under their kind of theater operation. So they were responsible for that. So the Koreans attached to the PLA, they are part of that group, part of the Lin Biao's first field army. Yeah.
And for the listeners who are trying to who might be looking things up as we speak, it's Hainan. You're not gonna find the battle if you spell it the way Carl's pronouncing it with his heavy Chongqing accent. He tends to get his N's and L's mixed up. So there's not much of an N sound in Southwestern Mandarin. So basically it's Hainan.
Okay. Yes.
Not Hailan.
Yes, man. Sichuan.
Yeah, the way you say Henan makes it sound like you're talking about the
Oh
Dutch.
yeah. That's
Henan.
actually a joke on the Chinese internet too. Like people just use Netherlands in place of the province of Henan, because people from Southwest like Sichuan, we don't distinguish our nasal N and L, right? Like it's all L for us. There's no N, like as in Nancy. It's all like land, like land party. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyways, it's not an attack. I like your dialect. I think people automatically sound cooler if they speak
It's
Southwestern
true.
Mandarin, but unfortunately, I don't speak it. I can imitate it, but I don't speak it. But basically, September 5th, the People's Daily, which is the party newspaper in mainland China, releases an editorial called "Message to Compatriots on Taiwan," calling for the Taiwanese people to fight for liberation. And on that day, Dulles from the U.S. goes to Taipei to talk with Chiang Kai-Shek. And then the U.S. sends 17 warships from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And then later that month, the so-called ROC's Navy and Air Force began operations, strafing coastal areas and offshore islands of Fujian, Zhejiang, and Guangdong.
Now, just to give a little bit more international geopolitical background, so by 1958, Stalin already died. Khrushchev arrives to take power in Soviet Union.
Oh yes, this
Yeah,
is
and
important.
Khrushchev's main diplomatic maneuver is he proposed to reach understanding, right, with United States. Like he's not for world revolution like Mao was. He was more about, okay, we can develop socialism within the borders of Soviet Union and the existing communist countries. We don't need to have like a World War III with United States. But Mao,
He started pushing, and he kind of caused a lot of confusion in the socialist
yeah,
sphere because he started pushing the idea that, for example, the Soviet Union was no longer a dictatorship of the proletariat, and it was a people's democracy, and that there's no more class
yeah,
conflict within socialist countries. And he also talked about how um, the international situation is different, and that these bourgeois democratic countries, can arrive at socialism through peaceful
right.
means and
I
stuff like
mean,
that. And he also
Mao.
solidified his power by just totally discrediting Stalin,
Yes.
and that by extension that kind of that was so then at that point Mao was thinking, okay, so what does he think of China and what are his attitudes towards
I mean, the
China?
the his the differences, the personal difference between Khrushchev and Mao, eventually led to Sino-Soviet split. But before that, in 1958, at this juncture, officially on the surface, China and Soviet Union still in honeymoon phase. But while U.S. is kind of carrying out all these warlike efforts against China with it's based on Taiwan. The Khrushchev is personally extending an olive branch to the U.S. government, and Mao was not pleased with that. So he took that opportunity to launch the Battle of Jinmen, basically.
And he did it right after Khrushchev had visited him, so the US was thinking, was Khrushchev
Yes,
involved?
yes. He Mao, even though Khrushchev was really eager to reach a understanding with U.S., but Mao took the opportunity while Khrushchev was visiting China to launch the Battle of Jinmen to make U.S. think that China and Soviet Union are actually coordinating together.
Yeah, Khrushchev was so
Yes,
pissed.
yes, he was not pleased. I mean, all
Yeah,
these
so
all these conflict between him and Mao eventually would blow up into Sino-Soviet split. But this is kind of like the beginning of the conflict of interest, right? Because Khrushchev wants to have a pursue peaceful coexistence with the West, with the U.S. But Mao, it's like, oh, wait a minute, we haven't achieved our national liberation yet. Like the Taiwan is still Taiwan still hasn't been liberated. What do you mean?
in Khrushchev, you should let our scientists go look at your nuclear
Yes,
designs.
yes, yes.
And then Khrushchev was like, no, no, you know what? We're just gonna get rid of all of our technicians. We're just gonna send them back to the Soviet Union and not help you guys
So
anymore.
yeah. So anyway, so that's a little
Yeah,
little sidetrack for little.
yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah,
important because the U.S.'s attitudes towards China was that the U.S. was eager to part of why Mao did that was because the U.S. was eager to exploit contradictions between China and the Soviet Union. And they believed that if China could somehow be won over towards, at least if it could stop being a Soviet ally, then it could be part of a plan to, surround the Soviet Union. And, because the Soviet Union was still the US's number one enemy at that time. So anyways, when the Navy and Air Force in Taiwan start these operations, the UK and Canada call for the US to return to Truman's policy of maintaining Taiwanese neutrality and to prevent Taiwan from becoming a hot war zone. And but at this point, Mao had another idea. His actions against Taiwan were a message to the world, and it was like a protest against their attempted isolation of China. So, because at this time, various solutions were being suggested at the UN, from formal Taiwan independence, which would involve recognizing the People's Republic of China as the legitimate government of China, and to create an independent republic on Taiwan, or a state called Chinese Formosa, or once again UN trusteeship, which advocate the line of Taiwan's undetermined status and have the UN govern Taiwan for a while. Another one, the funniest one, 1.5 Chinas was also another suggestion, which was essentially to make Taiwan a vassal state of the PRC, which actually, if you look at it, it's kind of similar to the one country, two systems solution in Hong Kong, but the difference is Taiwan under this solution gets to represent itself independently in foreign affairs, which I guess Joshua Wong will be really happy. But and then there's also another solution, which is the two successor states solution, which is to recognize both the PRC and the so-called ROC as successor countries of the ROC, and to let them both be considered founding members of the United Nations. Now, Dulles suggested having the PRC on the Security Council and the so-called ROC, and various solutions were being suggested at the UN at the time. One of them being formal Taiwan independence, which is to recognize the PRC as a legitimate government of China and to create an independent republic on Taiwan, or a state called Chinese Formosa.